Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slasher U, a college football podcast from Slasher Sports. I'm Christian Rao here with my co-host Steve Feck, and what a wild weekend of college football we had for you. I mean, we are to the point now, Steve, where we are finally deciding that we have a plethora of teams, a very small handful, if you will, that we're going to be seeing in the college football playoffs. We're starting to say goodbye to some teams who are no longer bowl eligible, and we're starting to get some of those other teams who are going to be very close. I think it's actually more exciting about who might not make the college football playoffs, but who might not make a New York NY6 bowl, if you will. There's a lot of still great questions to talk about. We got a new top 25 where we're going to see technically the number one and number two team play this Saturday. We got a lot of fun things to talk about in this one, but really what we'll get down to is talking about who we think is number one. We're going to talk about some crazy endings, and then we're going to get into the spirit of Halloween a little bit here. And of course, we got to talk about the football that's coming very soon, and that's Maction. Steve, what's going on? Welcome to the show. Happy Monday to you.
Happy Monday to you. I just sat there on Saturday and I was promising myself, hey, I went a little crazy the last couple of weekends. So I'm not going to get too involved on Twitter and going to so many games. And I was just flipping everywhere. There was just so many interesting things happening that, yeah, I focused on a game or two, but it was an amazing weekend of football. Of course, that makes things easier for us on Monday. There's lots of things to complain about as well as highlight and celebrate. So Monday moanings this week, I think we're going to moan more than we
Yeah.
feel.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to talk about. And I wouldn't know if I'd say it's easier. I think that there's a lot to unpack on Monday because of this. And that I guess that's what would make it easier because we definitely have not ran out of things to talk about. And I don't think we're going to at all on this conversation. We're going to have a hard time trying to put this one within an hour, I think. Honestly, this the biggest thing, the biggest question that comes to my head week after week when we talk about the certain unbeaten teams, Steve, is who deserves that number one spot. And we kind of had a pretty good debate last week about is it Georgia, is it Ohio State? But I think there's another team in the running now, Steve. And I think that is the Tennessee Volunteers. I truly do think Tennessee belongs in this conversation. After seeing what they did to Kentucky last week, this past week, and what they did to Will Levis, 3 interceptions. Now, one of them, tip drill. I don't know if you can really blame him. There was some bad throws by Will Levis, though. This defense, if you want to talk about the spirit of Halloween, first, those jerseys were absolutely immaculate. Those orange and blacks,
Yeah.
perfect uniforms to wear for Halloween weekend, right? But regardless, this Tennessee defense was absolutely lights out. Hendon Hooker, if he is not your Heisman favorite, you might want to go get checked by a doctor because he is absolutely incredible. Tennessee belongs in this conversation, Steve.
I think Tennessee is at the top of the conversation. I mean, I've been advocating for Ohio State, the last couple of weeks saying, hey, what has Georgia done? And I tip my hat, Georgia Bulldog fans, your team came to play on Saturday. They did not come to play at the level that Tennessee Volunteers came to play. So for me, I think the Volunteers have earned going into the big game against Georgia the number one ranking. Of course, that's not how coaches and sports writers and everybody are going to look at it because it's easier to just keep it where it's been. I think it gives analysts and coaches a comfort level if we just keep pumping out the narrative. Well, Georgia's the number one team in the country, and then when you have a weekend like this where Georgia really they spanked the Gators for all intents and purposes. Okay, so now we'll see. See, this is why we kept them at number one. We knew this is what was going to happen. That's not the spirit of the poll. The poll was supposed to be where is that team ranking as of now based on their resume for the whole season, but also coming off of what happened in the current week. So this resting back while Georgia was kind of napping in between quarters, with some of their opponents. For me, Tennessee is one, and I guess I have to give the nod to Georgia number two because Ohio State, as you had mentioned on Saturday, had a tougher time with Penn State. Penn State's another team that came to play. They didn't win because they never beat anybody that's a ranked opponent. But they came to play. They played a good game. So I think it's two SEC teams, 1 and 2, and so we're having our see on the FBS level we have a Super Bowl, it seems, every 2 weeks. You know, I mean, it's just because of all of the coverage. We talked about North Dakota State, South Dakota State a couple of weeks ago in FCS, where it was 1 versus 2. I say Tennessee's number one. And certainly after this weekend, we'll know whether that's a fact or whether it's fiction. But where are you lying on that?
Yeah, we'll get to Ohio State in a minute. I want to kind of stick to this Tennessee Georgia conversation because we are going to see technically number one versus number two, or number one versus tied for number two, if you will, in the AP vote. Both Tennessee and Ohio State received 1,500 votes in the AP, which tied them for number two. Tennessee did receive more first place votes if you really want to play the caveat on that one. But like I said, we've already mentioned the love of Tennessee here and the thoughts that we think this is a great team. I watched that Georgia-Florida game, and it wasn't as big of a blowout, if you will. Georgia really turned it on towards the end of the game, and their defense was lights out, and they caused Florida to punt. But there were moments at the beginning of that second half that Anthony Richardson tried to get it together. He threw some passes. Georgia got lucky on a pass. I'm sure you saw the viral catch by
I did.
Bowers. It was incredible. Don't get me wrong, but if that defender would have put both hands up, that's an interception. That's a completely different story to this narrative. And I don't think it's a complete game changer, this football game. Georgia still probably wins the game, but it's not by 22 points, right? So, which they did, by the way. Florida did cover the spread plus 22.5. Pretty wild. I was on the edge of my seat on that one. Looking at this Georgia squad, there's flaws, but this defense is absolutely immaculate. Tennessee, they only scored in the 40s this time. They didn't hit their average at 50s. That's something to really be concerned about, right, Steve? No, I think what's really impressive for Tennessee, though, is that they only held Kentucky to 6. I think we're going to see a pretty decent defensive battle. My biggest question is, can Tennessee commit turnovers against Stetson Bennett? Because we just saw him do it against Florida. He's had a hard time against Florida, though, okay? Maybe it's just one of those kryptonite games. And can Hendon Hooker put up yards and points against that Georgia defense, who is only averaging in the 200s yards per game? I think those are the biggest keys and biggest takeaways we need to talk about in this football game. It really relies on what defense is going to shine. Tennessee, can they get the turnovers? Can they get Stetson Bennett to do that? And can Georgia stop Hendon Hooker and that amazing offense of Tennessee? I mean, Jordan Hyatt, that guy can't be stopped. The way that what they do to this offense is they just find mismatches, and they'll run the same formation 1, 2, 3, 4 times until they can finally figure out that, okay, maybe someone's sleeping or someone's not paying attention. And then all of a sudden you got Hyatt just sneaking out behind another receiver, and then he's wide open because he was blocked by a linebacker. This new offense from Tennessee, I mean, Hendon Hooker is the perfect fit. It's the perfect fit. Tennessee is way ahead of where they should be right now because of the perfect fit of Hendon Hooker. I am really excited for this football game. I'm excited to see where the line starts off with this one. I think that's really where it's going to be right off the bat. I mean, the line for this one, I'm looking for it right now. Georgia's a 9-point favorite to start off this one. I mean, I'm pretty sure that's what Alabama was against Tennessee initially, too. Pretty sure Alabama was a 9-point favorite. Now, this is in Georgia. It's not in Tennessee. That's something to really keep in mind. I don't know. I think this is the game that really decides who is number one.
Yes.
Ohio State, I'm sorry. I know that there's a conversation that you might be along this conversation. I think it's true. I also think your counterpart with Michigan might be deserving this conversation as well. There is an argument. But after we find out these two best teams taking on each other, we will have a true number one, and not just the AP polls, but the college football playoff polls that come out on Tuesday. Speaking of Ohio State, we talked about, are they going to be able to handle Penn State? Penn State might be able to put it in a good running. It looked decent for a minute, Steve, but I was hesitant, and I even put it out on social media. I said Penn State's defense was this nice bend, don't break. They let them score a couple field goals initially, committed a turnover or two, but that's exactly what we saw in the Michigan game. Let's see if it can continue. Let's see if they can keep up the momentum. Did that happen? I mean, honestly, For the most part, it did on the Penn State defensive side. That Penn State defense was not the same defense we saw in Michigan.
No.
That was a
Yeah.
very good Penn State defense. What hurt Penn State was Sean Clifford. I mean, 100%. The interceptions, I mean, and some of them, do you give him credit or give him blame? They were knocked down, batted down at the line. Ohio State's defense was absolutely incredible. You still got to give him the blame. I mean, he's the quarterback. He's got to make those throws where only his receivers can get them, and his receivers can't get there if they're not even getting past the line of scrimmage.
Right.
What is ironic is at the beginning of the game, they made it certain that everybody saw that he had this quote coming out this week saying, "I need to have the best game of my life." Well, that didn't happen for Sean Clifford. And just like that, Franklin is now 1-10 against top 5 teams. A lot of issues for this Penn State squad. I'd like Ohio State. They proved to me that they are worth to be in this conversation, which I did mention before. I did have some concerns. I will say that I'm not as impressed with CJ Stroud as I thought I would be. He still belongs in the conversation for Heisman, but there were some moments that Penn State defense got to him. I mean, right before half, they were trying to score a touchdown. He didn't read the blitz, the man that was not getting blocked, and he got absolutely crushed. There's a couple moments where there were some wide open receivers where he didn't make those throws. CJ Stroud did not impress me as much as he should have. His stats on paper look great, so I'm sure he will remain in the conversation. But just as an eye test between you and me and the listeners here, I was not impressed. Hendon Hooker is my number one for the Heisman right now. Putting this all together, we asked the question, who's number one? Until I see otherwise, in my mind, which we're going to see on Saturday, my question will be answered on Saturday. Tennessee is the best team in the country to me, Steve.
Yes. I absolutely agree. And I want to go back a little bit to what you talked about with Tennessee's defense and kind of tied into what Stroud had to look at with the Penn State defense. Tennessee has done a great job adjusting their defensive looks from opponent to opponent to opponent. You saw it against Alabama. There were times where they hadn't seen, a scheme line up in front of them, and I think that caused some, not panic, but some nervous moments in the Alabama game. With Levis, absolutely, he had not seen some of the things that Tennessee was throwing at him.
Yeah.
And given the fact that they are so compromised on the offensive line, he probably took it a little bit more, on himself to try to force plays in there. Penn State always has multiple looks on defense. So Stroud has not had to face that against the Ohio Bobcats, and Rutgers runs some interesting defensive schemes as well. But again, he was seeing things that he had not seen before. That could pay dividends as you go into the college football playoff, and that, okay, he saw some things, maybe he didn't react the way that he should, but now he's learned. The coaching staff can say, okay, look, if they're going to put in a nickel situation, or if they're going to start blitzing your safeties, you have got this, you can go to your back. I mean, they can go over different scenarios, not only for the rest of the season, but also as they prepare for a college football playoff, if they get there. So with Stroud, it didn't concern me as much, but again, he wasn't prepared for what Penn State was coming at him. So these are all things that now happen and will get fine-tuned for the rest of the season. And especially when the college bowl rankings start coming out, I think they come out Tuesday.
Yep.
Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. Yes. So tomorrow night they come out. You're going to see more and more of that, I think, happening with the teams that are in contention, and that you're going to see more in adjustments. In the case of Hooker, I don't think it matters. I mean, you cannot shut him down. All you can do is limit the damage that the Tennessee offense is going to do. But for me, it's Tennessee 1, Georgia 2, Ohio State 3. And I generally don't go along with a lot of the college football analysts, but I love Joey Galloway as an analyst, and he was adamant that TCU is the number 3 team in the country.
I like what TCU has done, but they've lost. They've won a couple games close, and I will keep that as a caveat that that has happened. And I know that's an argument, and it's a fair argument. I do think TCU is a good team. I think Sonny Dykes is doing a fantastic job. Another team that's way ahead of schedule. They belong in this conversation as being someone who belongs in the college football playoffs. I don't know if I can put them as who is number one in the country right now, just because of those
Oh
tight
no.
losses. I honestly think Michigan deserves a seat in this conversation as well. What we've seen from Michigan with JJ McCarthy, his balance. I mean, he's leading the league, or leading the nation in completion percentage. A young quarterback like this, an offense that runs through Blake Corum, who is another Heisman hopeful. That defense looks pretty swell as well. Obviously, they played Michigan State, and the most exciting part of that was what happened afterwards in the locker room. But I mean, the game itself and what Michigan has looked at throughout the season. I mean, their opponents, other than the cupcake stuff at the very beginning, that once they've started to get into conference play, they've looked decent, and they took care. I mean, they took care of Penn State more than Ohio State did. If you really want to play, this and that. I know that it was in Michigan. It wasn't in Penn State. And Penn State obviously plays a completely different football game when they're home and away. Penn State you could make the argument, and it would be a very damn good one, that it's one of the hardest places to play in all of college football is in Penn State. You could make that argument. Penn State plays hard at home. However, Michigan beat Penn State worse than Ohio State beat Penn State. And what they did to that defense, a defense that looked pretty dang good against this Heisman hopeful and CJ Stroud and these amazing receivers and Marvin Harrison Jr. and company of Ohio State, makes you wonder, is Michigan being underlooked? Are they being overlooked, I should say? Are they not being paid attention to enough? That's something that we need to keep in mind here. I think that they deserve a seat at the table. At least they need to be let in the door.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And at this point, until they play, it's one word: Ohio State, Michigan. There is no separation between the two as
Agreed.
far as how you're looking at the rankings. What is interesting to me is the committee always talks about how they factor in the strengths of schedule and the conferences and things like that. The Big 12 by far is head and shoulders above the Big 10, top to bottom.
Top to bottom, yes.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. You could argue that the top two teams are better than the top team in the Big 12. I will grudgingly concede you that argument. But when we're looking at and I want to see what happens with these college football rankings, at least the initial one, we're going to get a better feel for where they're thinking. If they're applying the formulas they say they are, it's going to eventually go from Ohio State, Michigan as one compound word to Ohio State or Michigan, because they will fall victim to the strength of their conference. And that is where, for me, when I'm saying 1, 2, 3, 4, and I've got TCU at 4, I'm looking at college football playoff. TCU has earned that shot, and there's not going to be two teams from the Big Ten. I will be shocked if there's two teams from the Big Ten. And I follow the Big Ten relatively closely. I tend to follow the teams that are bad, but I follow the Big Ten pretty closely. And for me, TCU has the same argument that everybody that's been arguing for Georgia has. They win the football games. It might not be pretty. It might not be by large amounts. Maybe I don't think you could accuse TCU of sleepwalking through any of their games. I think that they've just faced great competition since conference play began, where I think Georgia might have taken certain games off, if you will. But I don't know. I mean, it's unfortunate, because certainly from what you see on when you're watching games or watching replays or highlight shows, and what you look on paper, Ohio State and Michigan technically should be in the top 4 based on what their performances are week in, week out.
Right.
But eventually, one of those teams is not going to be undefeated anymore. And if TCU keeps running the table, and even if Clemson keeps running the table, you have to have your undefeateds there.
I'm with you. I agree. I think if TCU is undefeated, they definitely make a spot in the college football playoffs. That Big 12 championship game, wherever it is, whoever is with TCU versus Kansas State, probably right now is the initial. And boy, we're going to be talking about Kansas State here in a minute. Once we get there, that game is going to be incredible, absolutely incredible. All right, before we transition and talk about our Halloween fun, let's talk about a crazy ending here on the FCS, Stephen. I know you were paying attention to it. This was one of the most exciting games, probably in FCS all year, all season. It was between Holy Cross and Fordham. It was for the lead in the Patriot, and this one came down to the wire. I mean, to the very wire, Steve. Take me through this one and take me through the crazy ending.
By far, these are the two best teams, not only in that particular league, in the FCS, but you can probably say in the Eastern time zone, these are the two best teams that are playing on the East Coast. You had a Fordham team that literally had the most efficient, with the most passing yards, the most touchdowns in Tim DeMorat. So as great as Holy Cross's defense is, and I will still say, despite giving up 45 points, I will still tell you that they are the most dominant defense in the FCS when everything kind of falls into place as far as they're playing their opponents. But you had a little bit of everything. You had Holy Cross struggle, at first trying to get their offense going. They jumped out to a lead. You had, for the second week end in a row, you had an awful, god-awful, fireable official call have a direct impact on what could have been the final outcome, but certainly going into the half, where you had a referee call, a personal foul call on a lineman because the Fordham lineman jumped up to block the pass, and all he did was do a regular block, but hit him up, here in the chest. They considered that, even though he didn't leap to do the hit, where it wasn't any kind of a targeting. He just reacted to the Fordham defender leaping up. They called that, so a touchdown came back, and ultimately then Fordham was able to score and took the lead going into the half. And then from that point on, and from the third quarter on, it was quarterback to quarterback. It was Clubber Lang and Rocky Balboa between Sluka and DeMorat. It was just back and forth. You had the occasional key defensive stop, and it was looking for a while that the home team Holy Cross was on the mat, and maybe they weren't going to make the count. They had some standing 8 counts there at a point, but eventually the game got tied. You went into overtime. And literally, because Fordham's offense was just so ridiculous, combined, before you even went to overtime, both teams combined had over 1,000 total yards. And actually, Holy Cross, who had been trailing most of the time, actually had 100 more yards than DeMorat. But DeMorat accounted for 6 touchdowns.
That's incredible.
It was just an amazing, but it was literally one play, boom, in the end zone in the first overtime. They decided to kick the extra point. Holy Cross had a more of a sustained, you want to really call it a drive because they start at the 25, but there was more of an actual drive. They scored, and at home, Holy Cross's coach Chesney is just so confident. When you see him interviewed, he just oozes confidence in what his team can do. And he's like, oh, no. We don't need to just keep pace and let the other team potentially dictate to us what's going to happen. We're at home. We're undefeated. We're going for 2. Now, technically, in FCS, by the third overtime, you have to go for 2. You have no choice. And then anything after that, it's nothing but 2-point conversions.
Mm-hmm.
So like 2 weeks ago when Rhode Island and Monmouth went 7 overtimes, 5 of them were 2-point conversion plays, basically. But they went for it. They did the 2-point conversion. Holy Cross stays undefeated. Holy Cross, no matter what metric you use for FCS, because FCS uses more of an analytic, statistical based, and which also factors in strength of schedule, as opposed to just the random coaches poll. And when you say coaches poll, quite often select media people do the voting for a lot of the coaches. It's been that way for 100 years. It's never going to change. At the smaller schools with smaller windows and maybe less access, though, in the day of streaming, to say I didn't have a chance to really watch this game or get tape on it. Every game is available. It's still the media guy that's technically making the vote, or the sports information directors making that. They're talking to media guys, and it goes in under the coach's name. But now Holy Cross has absolutely made a statement where, I mean, personally, I think they're in the top 3 now. Based on some of the results. You could argue that Weber State has earned a right to be in the top 3 now, but because of strength of schedule. But Holy Cross has certainly made a name for himself. 1-point win, sure. It was an amazing game. It is one of the most exciting football games I have ever watched. And as you can tell by the lines under my eyes and all the bags, I've seen a lot of college football over the years. This game was unbelievable. And it literally had every dynamic and every aspect that you would want in a game. Offenses, timely defensive stops, problems on special teams, big plays on special teams, the overtime, going for 2 as opposed to just trying to go to the second overtime. It had everything that if you were writing a script, that's how you want that game scripted out.
Nice. Yeah. 53-52 final and overtime here. Sluka, the quarterback for Holy Cross, absolutely incredible. 291 yards passing with 4 touchdowns, and then 174 yards rushing on the ground. He was responsible for over 450 total yards of the 607 yards of Holy Cross. I mean, absolutely incredible. They are the leaders of the Patriot. I'm looking forward to watching this team in the FCS playoffs, because they're going to make some noise in that bracket. They're going to make some absolute noise. It's going to be a very fun bracket. We're getting very close to those. We will be covering in full the FCS playoffs. As you know, here we do cover FCS. We're going to be starting to increase that content a little bit more here. I know that probably brings a little bit of cheer to Steve's ears over here as he's a junkie for the FCS, but rightfully so. There's some really good football in that division. All right, Steve, in the spirit of Halloween, because honestly, there are a lot that fall under this category. This week, what was the scariest loss of the weekend? There are a few to talk about. I'm going to go ahead and let you start first. I'll give you mine, then we can throw some honorable mentions out in there. So what was the scariest loss of the weekend for you?
For me, it was Oklahoma State, Kansas State. Yeah. I mean, literally, if I had a thesaurus here in front of me and I read every possible adjective to describe how bad and disheartening and demoralizing that loss was, I still wouldn't do it justice. Oklahoma State is a really good football team.
So we thought.
I mean, certainly offensively. And we talked a little bit when we were previewing this game. I mean, defensively, they've got their laps, but the matchup seemed pretty good, that they had a chance at keeping it, but they were just never even in this game. It literally, the analogy that I would use is that when we were kids, we had that little electric football thing, and you always had, after a while, the little things on the bottom that would vibrate that would cause them to move. They would get bent or torn or broken. So now suddenly, like, your quarterback would just only go in circles, or your running back, you couldn't get your guy no matter what you did, because you had just played so many games that worn it down. It was an electric football game, and that quarterback was just going round and round and round. And in the offensive guards, where it was like a hoedown. They were hooking arms, and they were cowboys. They were not doing that cowboy line dance kind of stuff. It was just awful.
Yeah, I mean, you look at this team. We were talking about it during our preview. This was one of our Saturday six packs. We said we're not sure if we're going to see Adrian Martinez, and we did not see them. And we thought that was going to be an absolute X factor for this football game because of how amazing Adrian Martinez is. That hasn't changed. That conversation has not changed. Adrian Martinez is still a great quarterback. But let's talk about let's talk about the junior from Downingtown, Pennsylvania. Okay, let's talk about Will Howard. How amazing he looked in that football game. He went for almost 300 yards, 4 touchdowns. No one saw that coming. If you told me you had on your bingo card that Kansas State would beat Oklahoma State by 48 nothing, if it would have been another one of those games, just like the Texas Oklahoma game, Oklahoma State, I know that your rival is the Sooners, but you don't have to match them completely to be shut out by almost, to the point. I know 49 nothing Texas, 48 nothing Oklahoma State. I guess he's still got a little bit of bragging rights on them, but come on now. This game was absolutely. I mean, I watched the condensed game. I watched the replay, and it was just a human highlight reel from Will Howard and Deuce Vaughn. Deuce Vaughn went completely lights out, averaged over 7 yards per carry, 158 yards on the ground. Oklahoma State just couldn't get it going. Spencer Sanders had a tough time. He threw a pick. They had 3 turnovers. The offense didn't get it going either for the Pokes. There was a really tough time for this team. I am I'm nervous for what Oklahoma State is going to look like for the rest of the year. This was a team where many, myself included in this conversation, believed Oklahoma State could be in the running at the beginning of the year to win this Big 12 championship.
Yes.
After watching them against Kansas State this week, I don't think that they're even in the contention to even be in the game. I think that Kansas State has really changed that entire narrative. Right now, I see it as TCU Kansas State for the Big 12 championship, and I think that would be a fantastic game. Especially if we see this Kansas State team show up like that, we might have a 2-loss champion in the Big 12. That's how wild it could be. Kansas State, I could see them winning out and finding a way to beat TCU, especially if they play like this. I really do. Kansas State has a tough schedule coming ahead. They do play Texas next week. That's a great game. Texas has figured it out, right? We've said the same thing about TCU. We see TCU in Texas in 2 weeks. Kansas State gets them first. We're about to see, this is like when we get into the nitty gritty with the Big 12 here, the deepest conference in all of college football. Texas versus Kansas State's really going to show, in my mind, if Kansas State's for real. I mean, we've already kind of seen it. We saw TCU already beat Kansas State by 10 a couple weeks ago, but that was still a good football game.
Yes.
I think the adjustments have been made. They just showed and proved against Oklahoma State. If they meet again in the Big 12 championship, could be a different result. All right, I'm going to give you my result here, my thoughts, because there were definitely a few of them. And I will say, initially off the bat, the Kansas State game wins the prize. What I'm saying is second place. But I was completely shocked when Wake Forest went down to Louisville.
Yeah.
Sam Hartman, I have been, what a great story. He comes back. He's having a great season. Wake Forest has put themselves on the map. They play a really good game against Clemson. The entire ACC took a hit this week, and Wake Forest was a big part of that conversation. They lose to Louisville. And Louisville's been one of those teams that have had probably more peaks and valleys than maybe any other squad. Maybe the other ACC loss with Notre Dame beating Cuse, they might have more peaks and valleys. But Louisville, I mean, the way they won the football game is the scariest part. They forced 8 turnovers on Wake Forest. This is a football team who we thought we could see possibly in the ACC championship. And that still hasn't really gone away based on what everything else happened in the conference. But man, Steve, this was a really tough game to watch. Louisville put the game on. Their defense showed up. They looked great, but Sam Hartman threw 3 interceptions, just like we've seen with some other top quarterbacks this week, throwing a lot of interceptions. We just didn't see some good work. Malik Cunningham, he didn't really have to do much. I mean, he only threw for like 160 yards. They didn't have to do much for this team. This offense didn't really have to do much. The defense really won the football game for them. It was 100%. I mean, there was 1 turnover by Louisville. There was 8 by Wake Forest. If you have a +7 turnover differential, you're going to win this game. And they won this game mightily. They won by 27 points against the number 10 team in the nation. I mean, incredible.
And it's not like Wake Forest was one of those, well, why are they number 10? Wake Forest climbed their way through the standings, and they showed why they were number 10.
Yeah. I mean, this is a team before Saturday who the only loss they had was to overtime to the Clemson Tigers.
Yeah, and Hartman. I mean, for me, Hartman is until this game would have been in the talk for the Heisman finalist. I mean, he's had just a great year coming back from an injury, and a pretty serious. It was a blood clot kind of a situation. So it's not like it was just he hurt his shoulder. I mean, theoretically, when you have that kind of clot in that area, that could be life threatening if you let it go. So, it was a great story with Wake Forest, but Louisville just had an answer for anything Wake Forest tried. I mean, it's great for a program like Louisville. It's bad for the ACC and any of its hopes.
Yeah.
Trying to get a New Year's Six, as many considerations for those higher bowls as possible. But
I think no other team experienced a worse bye week than the Clemson Tigers this week. Yeah. Because of the loss by Wake Forest, because the loss by Syracuse. I mean, it was a tough week for the ACC. Syracuse goes down. Now Notre Dame heads into Clemson. So that's a whole different ball game now. When you look at this Wake Forest, though, here, let's end off this conversation on the Deacons real fast. They have a tough rest of the year. They've already got their 6th win. They've won a bowl, great, but we thought this was going to be a completely different football team,
yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. Well, now this looks completely different. They play NC State, who have their troubles of their own. Obviously, a second-string quarterback finishing the season for them with Leary being down. But then they take on North Carolina, who looks like will be the winner of the Coastal. Well, at least there's the thoughts that will happen, right? The possibility right now, as it sits right now, Clemson UNC ACC final. So Wake Forest has to go against NC State, UNC, then Syracuse, who just lost to Notre Dame, but we've seen them be good, and then finish the season against Duke. I mean, there's a spot, there's a scenario where Wake Forest goes 6-6 this year.
Yes,
which is wild after what we've seen. I mean, after watching that game against Clemson, where Sam Hartman broke the school record and went absolutely wild, and I mean, honestly, was seconds away, a play away from winning that football game. Now talking about they might be a possibly 6-6 football team and getting a low-level bowl game in the ACC, pretty insane. I'm really going to be paying attention to this Wake Forest NC State game. I want to see if Wake Forest can make a comeback and rebound. I believe in Sam Hartman. Yes. I don't really believe too much in NC State right now either, based on what we saw this past week. They found a way to win the football game, but not, and it was against Virginia Tech, and it was not very pretty. So Wake Forest, obviously a better competition. I mean, even with probably 8 turnovers. So a lot to unpack for the ACC this week. Wake Forest is one of those teams that you got to pay attention to. All right, an honorable mention for this scary loss. We talked about Cuse against Notre Dame. That's obviously an honorable mention. How about UConn beating Boston College, sticking in the ACC? But not a single team scored a touchdown. I mean, what a wild loss on that one. That's a scary sight.
And I'm sure this has happened before in my lifetime. And there was a stretch where, again, I was more focused on college basketball, college hockey, college baseball. College football was there, but I mean, I was just focused on other programs. But it's happened twice this season. You had Iowa, South Dakota, right? That was 5-3. And now you have this. I mean, Boston College, great athletic tradition.
They are the most disappointing team to me this year.
You were so right. You were really high on them, and I really didn't have an argument when we were talking about them. When we were kind of planning, this podcast. I mean, I think they had everything that they needed. Or
it's definitely the offensive line that's making their issues. I mean, their defense hasn't been great either. There was a small concern in the beginning of the year. They did not make it a huge concern, but there was really no returners coming back on the offensive line since there was an injury at the beginning of the season, and their last returner, who didn't graduate or didn't move on to the NFL, got hurt. So at the beginning of the year, there was a whole offensive woe. But you look at what they had in talent. You got Zay Flowers, who arguably is going to be, the first Boston College wide receiver drafted in the NFL since 1987. You got Pat Garzo. I mean, Paul Jerkovich is really good. It's just, To me, this is the most disappointing team in the ACC. I didn't expect them to be like in the lead or like doing what North Carolina or what Syracuse did at the beginning of the season, but I expected this team to be like a 7-5 football team, not what they look at right now. And you're losing to UConn. Now, don't get me wrong, UConn is turning things around. Jim Mora's changing things. If their quarterback didn't go down at the beginning of the year, I think we might have a different narrative about UConn. So, and we think we will have a more narrative about them next year. But again, Boston College has been, in my mind, one of the most disappointing teams. We will definitely have that conversation more in the offseason. That's a team I'm going to pay attention to because I really Hadley. I think he really is a good one. Are you ready to close this one out?
I am.
What a better way to close this one out with what we are getting tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for some action. The MAC is back on Tuesday night starting tomorrow, and we got 2 games on the slate, 7 o'clock and 7:30, one on ESPNU and ESPN2. We got the leader of the MAC, the Buffalo Bulls, taking on the Ohio Bobcats. And then we have Ball State taking on Kent State. One game obviously better than the other. In this scenario here, we got 2, 5, and 3 teams between Buffalo and Ohio. That is the game to pay attention to. But Ball State and Kent State, that deserves at least some love as well. We still got the MAC here. Kent State a 4-point favorite. This game could be good. I mean, both these teams are still battling, still in contention for a bowl bid, right? Ball State's 4-4, 2 wins out. Kent State 3-5. They got a little bit more work to do, but they can still get there. I like what I've seen from some of these teams here. Your thoughts on this Ball State Kent State before we really dig into the UB game?
Well, Ball State, I think, has surprised a lot of people. But when you look at, their offensive talent, but by halftime of this game, it's quite possible they're going to have a 2,000-yard passer and a 1,000-yard rusher. So John Paddock is just one of those typical MAC quarterbacks. Can make the plays downfield, but he's more of a game manager. I mean, he really does. I never thought you could teach field vision, but that's something in the MAC tradition going back 3-4 decades. Quarterbacks come out and they see the whole field. Mm-hmm. When they're coming out of the huddle, even before they're at the line, they're coming out of the huddle and they're looking and they're seeing things, and they're either already calling audibles or they're adjusting on the fly for that. He's that kind of quarterback. Carson Steele, he's going to be one of those running backs that maybe doesn't get drafted, but comes in as an unsigned free agent when it comes time for him to graduate. And suddenly he's in the starting backfield, on Sunday. So he's a smart running back. He's great at finding holes. That's not to say Kent State doesn't have bringing anything to the table. I mean, Kent State, despite, they have a negative point differential, but they've played some tough opponents where they had some scores run up against them, and it's hard to catch that up. And that's pretty commonplace in the MAC, where you have a team where there's either 1 or 2 games where they really get the doors blown off because it's a payday game for them. Going to a Power 5 conference school and be able to bring in the payday, and it helps them learn, so that by the end of the season, all the MAC teams tend to get better as the season goes on. Even the bottom dwellers, they look better in November than they did in September and October, because they've learned from having to play at higher competition.
We saw Kent State play pretty well against Georgia. I mean, if we remember that game, I feel like when you look at this football game, that's something that you can remember, you can pay attention to. If you're not used to watching the MAC, you might have watched that game when Georgia took on Kent State, and Kent State didn't give up, didn't go. When you look at their defense, though, they give up almost 450 yards, but their offense is pretty good too. They go over 430 yards. I think Kent State has the advantage here being home. I know Kent State's a 4-point favorite. Lions agree with me. I think there's a strong possibility that Kent State can get their 4th win of the year here and keep their bowl bid alive. It'd be great to see Kent State get a bowl, because for how long have we seen Kent State be a bad football team? I really think I'm taking Kent State to win this football game.
Yeah, I'm with you there. The only thing that can go wrong is if their defense really has a down game and they allow either paddock through the air or Steele on the ground to break off some big plays. Kent State is undefeated at home at 3-0, and it's looking like they're going to be 4-0 after this game tomorrow.
Very strong way to do that. 4-0, getting yourself a 4 games, 2 out from a bowl. I'd love to see it for Kent State. University of Buffalo taking on the Ohio Bobcats in Ohio at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on ESPN2. UB is technically a 3-point favorite on the road with an over-under opening at 58.5. I love what the University of Buffalo has done so far this year. Yes, they had the loss to Holy Cross. They started off very weak with the loss against Maryland, a loss against Holy Cross, and then a loss against Coastal. 2 of those teams, and Holy Cross, as we've mentioned at the beginning of the show, are no pushovers. Those are actually some really good football teams. When the MAC play started, though, they completely turned it around. They started playing really good football. We saw what we saw last week against Toledo, coming back very strong, 24 points deficit. And I really love what that quarterback from Lakewood's doing, Cole Snyder.
Mm-hmm.
Really big fan of that guy. I think he has an opportunity to really do big things. He's only a sophomore. He's only going to get better. However, this season, they're taking on Ohio. The winner of this game will be the leader of the MAC East, a division in the conference we didn't think was going to be super strong. We thought it was going to be all about the MAC West. It's really not the case. I'm actually quite surprised. I'm looking forward to this one. As you can tell, I'm leaning towards the Bulls.
Right. And then again, let me reassure all of my close friends in the Buffalo, Niagara Falls, Erie, and Niagara County region. Okay, yes, I'm secretly pulling for the Bulls, but we have to show that we root for all teams on some level. That's why I've got my Ohio Bobcats shirt on. I would be happy if some of the people I know in Buffalo would send me some free Buffalo Bulls gear. I'll wear it every week if you give it to me. But right. I mean that's Christian's home area. It's his home turf there. So we're not going to complain if that stuff just shows up at our houses. But that aside, shameless plugging aside for free merch, this is going to be a very interesting football game. I'm wondering if the defenses show up, or is this going to be a MAC wide open, up and down the field kind of game? Ohio has a way, I think, of matching up well against UB, on both sides of the ball, where they could, quote unquote, surprise here. I mean, the line's not that big. I think it's a 1.5. The last one I saw that UB was favored
3
by
points.
3
point.
It's up to 3 point now. Okay, yeah. They've got a pair of backs. They could be the story of the game, and that's the great thing about Cole Snyder is that he doesn't feel that he has to be the guy that get on my back. I'm going to throw for 500 yards and we'll win. Okay, I think he learned from some of the early season games. Again, you mentioned Holy Cross. I mean, they're that big score against Fordham. I'm upsetting. They've got a great defense. Maryland has shown they've got a great defense, and Maryland has been better than a lot of people thought. You and I were very high on Maryland, but they've been better throughout the season. Coastal Carolina should be ranked. They were not ranked in this top 25, were they?
No. Okay, no, they had a bye week after the loss against Old Dominion, and then they did beat Marshall, but they're not ranked right now.
Yeah, but again, you shouldn't be punished for a bye week. But another show, another topic. So it's not like Buffalo lost to teams that were just, oh, what a shock. Oh, what a shock. Ohio, it should be fun. They can't turn the ball over. Their quarterback's thrown for almost 2,500 yards. He has more touchdowns than interceptions, but he's got a pretty significant amount of interceptions. So you got to hope Ohio can keep control of the ball. I can't wait. It's, if these were teams that hadn't even won yet, it doesn't matter. It's MACtion. There's something special about having MAC football, middle American conference football. It's a perfect name and a perfect highlight, and give credit to ESPN for figuring it out, because not only are there a lot of guys that are playing in the NFL that have come through the MAC, and a lot of coaches that have kind of sharpened their fangs, coaching in the MAC. They picked up on that. Very, very loyal fan bases, and it's translating now where now the entire country is excited
One more thing about Ron Cook Jr., because I do think it deserves a credit. You're right. I think that the running game for UB is going to be a big game difference. We saw Ohio averaging about 500 yards per game. They're letting their defense give up. It's a lot of yards.
Yeah.
Ron Cook Jr. got his first 100-yard rushing game on the season last week against Toledo, against one of the toughest teams in the MAC. He also had a couple good receptions. He had his best game last week. Now he heads into Ohio, who arguably lets up a lot of yards, especially, I think almost close to 200 rushing. Could be a big game. Could be a big game for Ron Cook and that running crew. All right, when you look at the Wednesday slate, because we do have two on Wednesday too, Maction is not just on Tuesdays, ladies and gentlemen. We have college football Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. This is when college football is at its absolute best. Once we get into November, and obviously Tuesday, November 1st, we made it. We got there. On Wednesday, we have two great games as well. We have Central Michigan taking on Northern Illinois and Western Michigan taking on Bowling Green. Nothing really at the tippy top, but still two good matchups in this one. Central Michigan and Northern Illinois. Northern Illinois is favored by 4 points in this one. Bowling Green. We've seen some interesting things about Bowling Green this year. They did beat, right? We saw what they done. They are a 3.5-point favorite in this one. What's your thoughts on the Central Michigan Northern Illinois game, Steve?
Remember when Central Michigan and was it Oklahoma State? Was that who they played? Really,
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it
Week
was
one,
Oklahoma
yep.
State. Yeah, right. And they made it a competition, and we were still drinking the Cowboy Kool-Aid there, and they really, I don't know, they impressed me. I'm like, wow, what a great game they played.
Yeah.
But
yeah, they only lost 58-44 to Oklahoma State at the beginning of the year. But I mean, it was a pretty decent game in itself. Richardson threw for 400 and something yards on that Oklahoma State defense. Daniel Richardson, he's a fun quarterback to watch. I mean, that is a quarterback that I'm probably going to pay attention to. I mean, this is in the entire game. He's thrown for over 1,700 yards, 13 touchdowns. He got 4 picks. So there are some woes there. But when you look at what he can do against this Northern Illinois defense, who is averaging, almost 400 yards per game, giving up and 268 in the air, I mean, there's a chance we could see him throw 300 yards on Wednesday night.
Yeah, and I think that in the MAC, if you have a team where you can exploit their secondary, that's where you start seeing some of the big plays that happen, and that's what makes Maction so exciting, is because you tend to see a lot of speedy, wideouts, quarterbacks that can run as well as beat you with their arm. So if you've got a leaky secondary, that can be a problem. They tend to have the big, hogs, on the offensive and defensive lines. So you have some of that play. The other great thing that you need to pay attention to is that so many of these guys that end up playing in the MAC have some kind of unique story as to why they didn't go to a Power 5 school, or some of them started at a Power 5 school and they wanted to come back home, whether it be for family reasons or that, they just found, wow, I'm no longer a big man on campus. I'm going to be a third or fourth stringer my whole career if I stay at a Power 5 school. Let's come home, play. They know that there's pro scouts in the stands. They know the games get on TV. Both the local ratings, and regional sports networks have great ratings for MAC games, as well as obviously games going on ESPN and ESPN Plus on the weekends. People watch these games. So listen for the stories. Usually you want to almost zone out when they're talking about stuff like this. There are so many great stories on every roster in the MAC. Listen to those stories because it's going to make you fall in love with MAC football.
Absolutely. I agree. Last one on the schedule, Western Michigan versus Bowling Green. When I look at this one initially right off the bat, what sticks out to me is the amount of interceptions from the quarterback from Western Michigan, Zach Salopek. I mean, looking at the stat line itself, 7 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. I mean, when you have more picks and touchdowns, you got a lot to worry about in my mind. And then you go down to the team stats and you look at the yards allowed. Western Michigan has less yards allowed than Bowling Green by almost 100, but they don't really get the offense rolling at all. They just average over 300 yards per game on the offensive side. Bowling Green can get it going a little more. I think their rushing game can do well. We've seen what Bowling Green can do. At least that's something in my mind, at least we've seen that portion. We saw them beat Marshall in overtime. We seen them beat Miami of Ohio. We saw them beat Central Michigan. And the biggest loss that they've had was against UCLA. And obviously, we know that that's a completely different story right now with how well UCLA has looked. I like Bowling Green this one, but this isn't one of those games where I would definitely be like, I got to play this game. I got to play the bets. This one could go either way in my mind. But with Bowling Green at home, being a 3.5-point favorite, I think it's going to be a beautiful Wednesday night, 7 o'clock Eastern in this football game. Give me Bowling Green to win the football game. I don't think I've ever said that my entire life. Give me Bowling Green to win that. Look, I said it twice.
They had a little stretch there, I want to say about 7-10 years ago, where they had some pretty good football teams for a bunch of consecutive years. But yeah, and again, we're talking about lines a lot because what people are interested in it. And you and I are both fall.
Oh, you got to get the lines out. It's a whole different aspect. If you're not really interested in the game, but you can throw a buck down even on playing the lines, you look at the game different. Like for example, the Florida Georgia game. I played the spread. It was plus 22.5. They won by 20. They only lost by 22. I was sweating, hoping that Georgia wouldn't score again.
Right.
Take a knee. You look at the game completely different.
Right. Or you have those little strips, the little office pools, and okay, that's all fun and that's great. But there's something, I think when you're talking about Power 5 schools, the lines somehow mean more because I think more money is bet on those games. It's easier to get information. I think that not that the sports books do a bad job with getting information on, the MAC or other conferences, Conference USA, whatever it is. But they know where the money's at, and they're focusing most of their resources on the Power 5 conferences. Just enjoy. It's MAC football. It's MACtion. Enjoy it. This is one of those times where don't worry about the line. Honestly, I cannot tell you one line from any FCS game all year. I just can't tell you one.
Very fair. Very fair. I hope you all enjoy MACtion. Tuesday and Wednesday games are going to be fantastic. The fact that we have college football Tuesday through Saturday this week is just enough for me. Just because we have college football doesn't mean we won't be here. We'll see you on the feeds throughout the week. We're going to talk about these MACtion games. We have so much more to talk about. We got some athletic director hirings. We have some possibility new coaching carousel. We're going to get the new college football rankings out. We have a lot to talk about this week, and then we'll get into some game previews as we get closer and closer, not just with FBS, but with FCS now too, really digging in to some of these teams as we get closer to playoffs and bowl season. We're going to have some great guests on soon as well, really working some stuff behind the scenes. So again, thank you so much for making Slasher Sports your stop for college sports. It's going to be an epic ride as we continue on here. Stop by our YouTube page to get content every single day. We're going to see you back here next time for another episode of Slasher U. Take care.